Hey, what's going on, everybody? Brent Hyden here, coming at you on this Wednesday morning, talking 11 games around the NBA. We have a ton to talk about, and just like every other day, I'm going to try to keep this one as short as possible. So we're going to dive right in. Houston at Charlotte, the first game of the night. Houston 4.5 point favorites in this game, a 228 over under. Marvin Williams is doubtful for this game. Um, Looking at the Houston side, it's going to depend a little bit on the starting lineup. We have seen Kenneth Faried actually get into the starting lineup last game, even with James Harden being back, and that moved Eric Gordon to the bench. I'm still perfectly fine with James Harden in all formats, coming off a putrid outing. Price tag 11.2 on DraftKings, 12K over on FanDuel. A little bit restrictive, especially on a 11 game slate. But in tournaments, I do think there is some merit to using James Harden here. Still owns it like a near 40% usage rate with Chris Paul on the floor. Gets a great matchup with Charlotte, being one of the worst defensive teams in the NBA against opposing shooting guards. They rank 27th in defensive efficiency. I do like Chris Paul. Pretty strong option here. Has top 40 fantasy points in 6 of his 11 games since returning from injury. He's 8,400 over on DraftKings, 8,700 on FanDuel. I like him as a cash game option for sure. Charlotte giving up 45.4 rebounds per game to opponents, along with 49 points in the paint. Both Clint Capella and Kenneth Faried in good spots here. I am a little bit worried about Clint Capella if Kenneth Faried is in the starting lineup. So I would say Capella more of a tournament option regardless, but definitely someone that is just a large field MME type play for me if Kenneth Faried is in the starting lineup. Um, Charlotte giving up 55 fantasy points per game to opposing centers, 23rd in defensive efficiency. Fareed averaging 1.24 fantasy points per minute when playing alongside Capella. That's about a 40-minute sample size so far. He is someone that I do have interest in, 5,900 over on DraftKings in tournaments as well if he's in the starting lineup. Eric Gordon, I think, is my favorite way to get exposure here to this game. He's 4,800 on DraftKings, 5,500 over on FanDuel. Still going to see like 30 plus minutes off of the bench. Coming off of the bench actually does help his usage a little bit. Only sporting a 21% usage rate over the last 30 days, but has 24 plus fantasy points in 7 straight games and 13 of his last 16. That makes him a really strong cash game option. On the flip side of this, Kemba Walker, clear cut top option going up against Houston. Houston still struggling to defend opposing shooting guard or point guards. 18th in defensive efficiency to the position. I do really like Kemba Walker. 8,500 on DraftKings, 8,800 over on FanDuel. Coming off a little bit of a down game against Golden State, the minutes have been insane recently, 41, 40, 36. This is a spot where I am definitely interested in going back to the well with Kemba Walker, 31.8% usage rates for the month of February. When you pair him with Cody Zeller on the floor and you take Jeremy Lamb off, I'll get to that in just a second, 36.8% usage rate, 1.44 fantasy points per minute. So moving Jeremy Lamb to the bench has been a big boost for Kemba Walker. Now, Marvin Williams is doubtful for this game, so that could move Jeremy Lamb back into the starting lineup. You could see Nick Batum slide back down to the 3, Bridges slide to the 4, starting alongside Cody Zeller. You could also just see Michael Kidd-Gilchrist get in the starting lineup at the 4, and they keep Jeremy Lamb off the bench. I would not be shocked if that was what happened. We could also just see like Frank Kaminsky get into the rotation, so that would be something to keep an eye on. Kind of depends on what we see here. Nick Batum is perfectly fine in cash if Jeremy Lamb is coming off the bench. Houston is really struggling to defend the 3-point line. He has at least 20 fantasy points in 14 of his last 15. Houston has allowed opponents to shoot 37% on above the break threes over the last 10 games. He takes 33% of his shots there. Bridges and Kidd-Gilchrist are fine on FanDuel as drop score candidates. Um, I'm a little bit more intrigued in Kidd-Gilchrist than I am Bridges. I just don't see it with Bridges. And if both of these guys are going to be popular, I'm probably going to be trying to find other places to go. I know Bridges did have that good game against Washington, um, but outside of that, he just doesn't really do much. Um, needs the steals and needs the blocks really to have a ton of value, and I'd rather look elsewhere if he's going to be chalk. Again, on FanDuel where you can drop a score, I'm fine with it. Kid Gilchrist, I think, is a little bit more interesting. He's also someone that just doesn't do a whole lot. Like, there's just not a whole lot there for him. Very empty stat lines, very empty minutes most nights, but at 3,200 for a guy, if he gets in the starting lineups, going to play closer to 30 minutes, is at least interesting. I do kind of like Cody Zeller here. Price way up, 6,800 on FanDuel, 5,800 over on DraftKings. Has scored at least 30 fantasy points in 4 of his 8 games since returning from injury. That includes the 53 fantasy points against Golden State. Houston has struggled to keep opponents off the glass. Their issues defending the rim and the paint is a boost to Zeller, but there's better places that I'm going to be looking in that price range here tonight. Looking at Washington, Brooklyn here. Brooklyn, 5-point favorites, a 237 over under. From the Washington side, most of my interest is in Bradley Beal and Bobby Portis. Beal, month of February, 28.3% usage rate. Still a 29% usage rate whenever you have Bobby Portis in the starting lineup alongside of him, averaging 1.39 fantasy points per minute in those minutes. I really like Bradley Beal against a Brooklyn team that does struggle to defend shots in the paint in the mid-range. That's where he takes a lot of his shots, 32% of his shots coming in those areas. So I really, really like Bradley Beal here. 8,900 on DraftKings, 9,900 on FanDuel. A really, really strong option. Bobby Portis, 1.20 fantasy points per minute, starting alongside Bradley Beal. He's 6,300 on DraftKings, 7K over on FanDuel. Has been pretty good for the Wizards outside of the Pacers game. But outside of that, a couple 30-plus fantasy point games and in a very short amount of time since coming into Washington. Obviously, Nets giving up almost 60 fantasy points per game and ranked 27th in defensive efficiency to opposing centers. So Bobby Porter's a core option for me here tonight. You can look at Jabari Parker, been really inconsistent, but he makes for a pretty strong tournament option. Trevor Ariza, really strong cash game option. Some news and notes, or some notes about those guys in the breakdown, so be sure to check that out. On the Nets side of things, it is worth noting that Russell has been held to a total of just 16 points on 6 of 20 shooting over the last 2 games with Washington. I don't expect that to continue. I really, really like D'Angelo Russell, who over the last 30 days has a 33.2% usage rate to go along with his 15.4 potential assist, 88 touches per game, averaging 25.8 points on 36.4% three-point shooting and 8.1 assists. Dream matchup here. Washington playing at a fast pace, playing really poor defense, 26th in defensive efficiency to opposing point guards, allowing them to shoot 37% from 3. He still averages 1.26 fantasy points per minute with Karis LeVert on the floor this season. So the whole narrative that his production takes a hit with LeVert being back is not true. Yes, his assists do have the potential to go down, but the production is still there for him. So he's someone that I have a lot of interest in. I really like Karis LeVert. Minutes, really tough to trust. I do currently have him projected for 30 minutes, which makes him a really, really strong play. Washington allowing opponents to shoot 66.5% at the rim. He takes 42% of his shots at the rim, so I really like the price tag on Karis LeVert. 5,800 again over on DraftKings, 6,400 on FanDuel. Hoping he gets, closer to the 30 minutes. He has seen at least 30 minutes in 2 of the last 4. Would have been closer to 30 had that Spurs game probably stayed a little bit closer. So I really like Karis LeVert. You can look at Joe Harris, really strong cash option. Crab and GPPs. Crab on FanDuel, really, really interesting at 4K. Even interesting over on DraftKings as well at 3,800. He's just another one of these wing guys where it's kind of tough to trust. Production could definitely be there if he gets the minutes against a Washington team that really struggles to defend the three-point line. I like Damari Carroll in cash as well. Continues to be a guy playing mid-20s in minutes, getting you like mid-20s in fantasy points. So for cash games, he's a great way to get some exposure here. You can look at Jarrett Allen as well. Definitely someone to consider at 5,200 on DraftKings, 6,100 over on FanDuel. Again, someone else, minutes are tough to trust. Really, really strong matchup here, though. Washington getting pounded on the boards. He takes, again, allowing opponents to shoot 67% at the rim. They are giving up 47.6 rebounds, 14.5 second chance points, and 51 points in the paint per game. So that makes Jarrett Allen definitely someone to look at. There's some other interesting center options in that same price range that have me like a little feeling a little bit more secure about their minutes and their production. But in tournaments, I really like Jarrett Allen. Moving on, Golden State at Miami. Not going to spend too terribly long on this game because it's not terribly attractive. 224 over under. Golden State 9-point favorites in this one. Justice Winslow is probable. Jordan Bell questionable. Derek Jones Jr. probable. James Johnson questionable. Rodney McGruder questionable for this game. Golden State side of things, Stephen Curry always one of my favorite options. We know basically Golden State's analysis is the same almost every single night. Miami allowing opponents to shoot over 36% on them above the break threes. Miami does rank second in defensive efficiency to opposing point guards. That is a little bit concerning, but I still really like the price tag. 9,100 on DraftKings, 9,300 over on FanDuel. Pretty strong spot for him. Draymond Green, I think, is my second favorite option here. Obviously, usage is only like 13% on the season. Miami, 22.2 points allowed to opposing power forwards, allowing them to shoot 46% from the floor, 38% from three. We just know he's a guy that fills up the stat sheet. 5,900 is really, really appealing for Draymond Green, who up and down, definitely. But the potential is there for him for the assists, the rebounds. And again, with Miami really struggling to defend power forwards, that $5,900 price tag is just way too cheap over on Draymond Green. Really strong option there. Still a pretty good play over on FanDuel as well. Kevin Durant. Pretty safe floor. Generally a guy that I prefer mostly in GPPs. Has top 40 fantasy points in 8 of his last 10 games. So even in cash at like 9,200, while that's not the greatest return on that salary, it's fine. I'll take that if I can feel pretty secure in getting that 40 plus fantasy points most nights. DeMarcus Cousins, not a great matchup. 8K on DraftKings, 8,600 on FanDuel is fine. It's just I'm going to be looking elsewhere in that price range at center. On the Miami side of things, a lot's going to really depend on the status of the Whitesides, James Johnsons, all that stuff. Dwayne Wade, obviously my favorite option here regardless, continues to come off the bench, continues to have a usage rate over 30% off of the bench, continues to be cheap, continues to be a guy that puts up solid numbers, never, most nights not great numbers, but rarely kills you. Has scored at least 25 fantasy points in 8 of the last 10 games. Yeah, so it's just a really good spot here for Dwayne Wade, who is just a guy like in cash, like at 5,100. It's kind of like Malcolm Brogdon, JJ Redick, just a guy that I like because he's going to give me a safe floor with a little bit of upside. So Dwayne Wade, my favorite option here. Justice Winslow is interesting. Takes 30% of his shots at the rim, where the Warriors are allowing opponents to shoot 65% on the season. Also, they give up 15.1 fast break points per game. That's a little bit of a boost for Justice Winslow, who comes in at 5,200 over on DraftKings. That's really appealing. 6,200 over on FanDuel, a little less appealing. I do like the spot here for him. I don't expect Goran Dragic to eat into his minutes much, if at all. So he's definitely someone to consider here. Josh Richardson, really strong cash and tournament option, just erupted against the Warriors last time these teams faced off. It is a little concerning. He has not been great over the last 30 days, averaging 0.86 fantasy points per minute, but 42% of his shots come from three. Warriors have allowed opposing small forwards to shoot 37% from three this season. So if you want to get some exposure here, Josh Richardson, Winslow, Wade would be the ways to go. I certainly think you can dig into my notes for Whiteside, Bam, and all those guys by checking out the breakdown. Let's move on to Minnesota at Atlanta. Minnesota 4.5 point favorites in this game, a 236 over under. Jeff Teague questionable for this game. Miles Plumlee remains out. I do absolutely love Karl Anthony Towns in the spot against the Hawks. Fast-paced game, poor defense. Towns should absolutely feast. Still averaging over 1.5 fantasy points per minute, even with Rose and Teague being back. He's 10-6 over on DraftKings, 11-2 over on FanDuel. It is a great spot for Karl Anthony Towns. I think I prefer him right now if Jeff Teague sits, just because how my lineup construction is going to go. But he's perfectly fine pretty much in all formats. Jeff Teague is interesting if he's able to play, averaging 1.06 fantasy points per minute without Covington on the floor. At $5,600 price tag over on DraftKings, really, really appealing if he plays. He's 6,700 over on FanDuel. That's still somewhat appealing there. Tyus Jones and Derrick Rose would be the guys to look at if Jeff Teague were to miss this game. Just because the extra usage and things like that would go around. Dario Saric, Taj Gibson, you can use them in GPPs. I don't know that I really trust the rotation too much. Last game could have been a little bit of an aberration. I still have Saric projected at about 25 minutes. That makes him a pretty strong value at 4,300 on DraftKings, 4,500 over on FanDuel, so it's fine. Atlanta really, really bad against opposing power forwards. 21st in defensive efficiency against the position this season. So one of those guys should be able to have a good game here. I'm going to lean towards Saric being the guy. Andrew Wiggins, I prefer him if Towns is out. I prefer him in games when Towns is out. But this is kind of the perfect matchup to throw that out the window. Atlanta 28th in defensive efficiency to shooting guards. They've allowed opponents to shoot 36.3% from three. They've allowed 45% field goal percentage in the paint and the mid-range, where Wiggins takes 42% of his shots. He does have a 22.4% usage rate over the last 30 days. He's 6,200 on DraftKings, 6,700 on FanDuel. I still really like the price tag for him. I like the opportunity for him. He's going to get his shots. He's going to have the opportunity to put up a big game, so I do like Andrew Wiggins in tournaments here tonight. On the Atlanta side of things, Trae Young, Taurean Prince are the two guys I'm looking at most. I went in depth a little bit on Trae Young in the notes, so be sure to check that out. But Taurean Prince is the guy that I'm going to highlight here. Been really, really inconsistent lately, scoring below 20 fantasy points in 5 of his last 10 games, but above 30 in 3. Matchup is ideal. 51% of his shots come from 3. The Wolves allowing opposing small forwards to shoot 40% from 3 this season. I really like the price tag on Taurean Prince. I really like the matchup for him. This is a spot where he's going to be a core option for me at 4,500 on DraftKings, 5K over on FanDuel. I really, really like Taurean Prince here. I did talk about John Collins, Dwayne Dedmon in the notes as well, so be sure to check that out. But let's move along to Portland at Boston. Boston 3-point favorites in this one, a 227 over under. Evan Turner, Aaron Baines out for this game. Damian Lillard, very, very appealing in this spot. Obviously, we don't love taking anybody against Boston. Their defense, for the most part, is pretty good. They've been a little bit bad recently. Lost 5 of its last 7 games, but this is a spot where I definitely have some interest in Damian Lillard coming in at 8,800 on DraftKings, 9K over on FanDuel. Lillard leads the team with 12.5 drives per game. He is assisting off of those drives on 10.7% of those drives. Boston has a lot of bunch shoot 63.4% at the rim over the last 10 games, 44% in the paint, 37% from 3-point range. Lillard, a combined 80% of his shots in those areas. 8,800 on DraftKings, 9K over on FanDuel. I do really like Damian Lillard in this spot. I think he's going to be a guy that goes overlooked, and that's probably a mistake. I definitely think he has upside in this matchup with a pretty solid floor. You can look at CJ McCollum, always just a GPP option, but it's mostly Lillard for me in this spot. Boston has a lot of opposing centers to pull down almost 16 rebounds per game. They've allowed 22.5 points per game to them, allowing them to shoot 53.2%. Given that they do struggle, allowing 44% shooting in the paint and 63.4% at the rim over the last 10 games, that makes Jusuf Nurkic someone that I definitely have interest in. 68% of his shots come at the rim, 19% of his shots in the paint. He's 7,500 over on DraftKings, 8K over on FanDuel. Obviously, the addition of Enes Kanter lowers the minutes floor or I should say, lowers the safety of the minutes floor for Yusuf Nurkic, who had a monster game against Boston last time these teams faced off. But I still really think he makes for a great tournament option. Al-Farouq Aminu, 4,300 over on DraftKings, 5,100 over on FanDuel. Always someone that I have interest in. Most nights I feel pretty confident he's going to get me 20 plus fantasy points, and I'll take that safety on a nightly basis. On the Boston side of things, given how bad they've been playing, wouldn't shock me if maybe Brad Stevens rested someone or pulled some craziness. Again, losing 5 of the last 7. Gordon Hayward's averaging just 7 points on 4 of 14 shooting over his last 2 games. They have not been playing very good. Jason Tatum, I think, is my favorite option here. Trailblazers, really bad against opposing small forwards, allowing them to shoot 46% from the floor, 39.4% from 3. Portland also allows opponents to shoot 45% in the paint over the last 10 games. He does take 45% of his shots from 3 or in the paint. So Jason Tatum, 6K on DraftKings, 6,700 over on FanDuel. My favorite option here. He's averaging 35 fantasy points per game over the last 30 days. Marcus Morris is also in a really good spot. Portland 23rd in defensive efficiency to power forwards. A 36% three-point percentage allowed to the position, 47% field goal percentage overall. I definitely like him as well. Al Horford averages less minutes in back-to-backs, so that's something to keep an eye on, but I still think he's interesting at his current price tag, 6,300 on DraftKings, 7,800 on FanDuel. Other than that, Kyrie Irving, obviously in a good spot, 28% of his shots as above the break threes. Portland above average defense against point guards, but they do allow opponents to shoot 38% on above the break threes. Looking at Chicago at Memphis, 3-point favorites in this game, a 215 over under. Otto Porter questionable, Jaren Jackson obviously out, CJ Miles questionable, Chris Dunn questionable, Yvonne Robb is doubtful, Avery Bradley is probable. We just saw this game right before the break. I have interest in really just 2 options from the Chicago Bulls side of things, maybe 3 or 4. Lauri Markkanen, obviously been on fire, 26.6% usage rate, averaging 25.2 points on 47% shooting, 12.5 rebounds, 2.7 assists per game over the last 10. He's averaged over 80 touches per game and almost 18 rebound chances per game since the trade deadline. I still really like Lauri Markkanen in the spot. I know the price tag is coming up. He has been playing extremely well. Memphis is a tough defense, and they are a slow team. But with Marc Gasol off the floor and Jaren Jackson off the floor, that defense takes a pretty big hit, and their pace actually goes up. Their pace actually would match what the Chicago Bulls pace is right now, which is a 101. That is what they've been playing at whenever those guys have been off the floor. They've allowed opponents to shoot over 50% on 2-point attempts and over 36% on 3-point attempts this season without those guys on the floor. I still really like Lauri Markkanen as a core option in the spot. I rarely have interest in Zach LaVine outside of GPPs. 17.5 field goal attempts per game since the trade deadline. Memphis allowing a very high field goal percentage at the rim without Jackson, so he still has upside for me. Again, just a GPP guy because he's so heavily reliant on that scoring, but he's definitely someone to take a look at. Otto Porter's fine, still taking a bunch of shots, has shot over 50% from 3 since joining the team. Memphis 14th in defensive efficiency to small forwards over the last 10 games, allowing them to connect on 51% of their shots, 38% of their 3-point attempts. Over the last 10 games, Memphis 7th in defensive efficiency to centers, but Robin Lopez playing a pile of minutes, playing really well, has topped 30 minutes in 3 of his last 4 games and 30 fantasy points in 4 straight. One of those was against Memphis. So Robin Lopez at 4,500 on DraftKings, 5,600 over on FanDuel. A pretty good option here tonight. I went in depth on Valanciunas and Joakim Noah in the notes, so be sure to check that out there. The guy that I'm going to highlight here with the Memphis side is Avery Bradley. I did not think I'd be in a situation this season where I was hyping up Avery Bradley, but here we are. I also did cover Mike Conley in the notes, DeLon Wright in there as well, so make sure you give those a read. But Avery Bradley, Um, 54% of his shots come in the mid range. He's averaging 12.7 2-point attempts per game over the since the trade deadline. Chicago has allowed opponents to shoot a pretty high percentage in the mid range, 41.7% on the season. So I really like Avery Bradley here. He's been really good, has topped 25 fantasy points in 4 of the last 5 games. He's still cheap, especially on DraftKings at 4K, 4,500 on FanDuel. Projection's never going to really force him to jump off the page. Part of that's because like his Clippers averages were just so bad. But this is a good spot here for Avery Bradley, and he's someone that I'm going to be using as one of my top value plays on the slate. Moving on, Indiana at Dallas. This game is not a whole lot to talk about. I'll knock Dallas out real quick. If you want to use Luka Doncic, you use Luka Doncic. Matchup is terrible. Not the spot that I would really want to force exposure at 9,300 on DraftKings, 9,800 over on FanDuel, but averaging a 33% usage rate, 24.1 points, 9.3 rebounds, 7.4 assists per game since the trade deadline. So still someone that you can consider here tonight. And if you're building like 20 plus lineups, get some Tim Hardaway Jr. in there as well. The Indiana side, much more interesting. The two guys that I'm going to highlight here, Darren Collison and Miles Turner. Collison, 1.04 fantasy points per minute without Oladipo on the floor. Dallas, 19th in defensive efficiency to opposing point guards. Has scored 30 fantasy points in 7 of his last 10 games. I really like the floor and the upside here for Darren Collison in this matchup. Someone that does take a decent amount of his shots at the rim. And that's important to note because Dallas really struggling to defend at the rim. 66% field goal percentage allowed. Darren Collison is taking 30% of his shots at the rim. So really good way to get exposure to this game at 6,100 on DraftKings, 6,800 over on FanDuel. Miles Turner, really high up on my radar here tonight. One of my top center plays on the slate. 6,300 on DraftKings, 7,300 over on FanDuel. Domantas Sabonis is out, and that doesn't necessarily mean that Turner is going to get more minutes. It does help secure the minutes floor for him. He is averaging 1.18 fantasy points per minute without Oladipo on the floor. Dallas, 22nd in defensive efficiency over the last 10 games to opposing centers, given the fact that they really struggle to defend the rim. 66% field goal percentage at the rim, where he takes 31% of his shots. I really like Miles Turner here. It is also worth noting there's some block upside for him here as well. There are several guys in that Dallas lineup. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 guys in that Dallas lineup that take over 20% of their shots at the rim. I'd say there's some block upside out there for Miles Turner, who is just too cheap, I think, over on DraftKings. Did struggle against Milwaukee, did struggle against Detroit, somewhat predictable, but has some 40-plus fantasy point outings in there, about a fantasy point per minute against Dallas earlier this season. Let's move on. Detroit at San Antonio. Not a whole lot that I'm going to cover in this one outside of Blake Griffin, Andre Drummond. Two guys that I do have my eye on. Since the trade deadline, Andre Drummond, 24% usage rate, 1.60 fantasy points per minute. The Spurs have allowed 120 points per game to opponents over the last 10 games, to go along with 45.3 rebounds, 50% shooting, 39% three-point shooting. That was while they were on their rodeo road trip. That is worth noting. They are now back at home. That could play into a little bit, but I still have interest in Andre Drummond at 9K on DraftKings, 10-5 over on FanDuel. Unfortunately, center is really deep, and there's a few guys that I really like, much more than Andre Drummond. So in tournaments, he's definitely a good way to go. I think Blake Griffin, fresh off a triple-double, 32% usage rate, 1.29 fantasy points per minute. Since the trade deadline, is a good way to get exposure here if you want to be if you want to get a little bit cheaper exposure. 87 on DraftKings, 89 over on FanDuel. Really good spot here for Blake Griffin. I think in cash, single entry, 3 max, stuff like that, I'm going to go Blake Griffin over Drummond. But if building 150 lineups or going in like a very large field GPP, Drummond is potentially the better play. Reggie Jackson been playing really well since the trade deadline. 1.08 fantasy points per minute, 27% usage rate. Spurs 25th in defensive efficiency to opposing point guards on the season. He's still cheap, 5,500 across the industry. Obviously, Ish Smith being there does eat into the minutes floor a little bit for Reggie Jackson, but he has at least 25 fantasy points in 8 of his last 10 games. On the Spurs side of things, I dug into DeRozan, Aldridge, all those guys in the notes. The one guy that I do want to highlight here is going to be Derek White, who is 2 games back from injury, sat out 1 game against Brooklyn was the game. I believe that's the one he sat out. Or was that the one he played? So it was the game before Brooklyn that he sat out. Anyways, he's 4,600 on DraftKings, 5,700 on FanDuel. I like his DraftKings price tag here. I would expect him to get closer to 30 minutes here. He's always been a guy that I rely on in cash, mostly because there is a pretty safe floor for him. 27.5 fantasy points against the Nets, 25 minutes again. Detroit 20th in defensive efficiency to point guards on the season. Given that they really struggle to defend the rim, allowing opponents to shoot 68% there, they do struggle to defend in the paint in the mid-range. That's kind of where he takes most of his shots, like 39% of his shots at the rim, 37% in the paint in the mid-range. I like him as a value point guard option on tonight's slate. Clippers at Utah. Utah 9.5 point favorites, a 228 over under in this game. Clipper side of things, it's Lou Williams, and that's pretty much it for me. 7,100 on DraftKings, 7,800 over on FanDuel, 35% usage rate over the last 30 days. Utah, struggling to defend in the paint. 26% of his shots come in the paint, they struggle to defend in the mid-range. Sorry, 26% of his shots come in the mid-range. Opponents are shooting 42% against Utah this season. Another 20% of his shots are above the break threes. They have a lot of opponents shoot 36.5% on above the break threes. So he's someone that I have my eye on here tonight. Outside of that, not really looking at anyone else from the Utah side of things. There's better places to look. Or the Clippers side of things, there's better places to look. On the Utah side of things, the 2 guys I'm going to highlight here before moving on to the next game, Rudy Gobert, 8,200 on DraftKings, 9,700 on FanDuel. He is my center lock button play of the day. Clippers giving up almost 60 fantasy points per game to centers. They have surrendered 46 rebounds per game to opponents, along with ranking 30th in defensive efficiency to opposing centers. Rudy Gobert should absolutely feast. Pulled down 15 points, 12 rebounds against Dallas, his 7th straight double-double. He had 23 points and 22 rebounds the last time these 2 teams faced off. It was his lone 2020 outing of the season, and one of his 2 20 rebound performances of the season. I absolutely love Rudy Gobert, who should just feast in this spot. He is, again, my lock button center play of the day. I really like Derek Favors as well. Incredibly appealing as like a cash / GPP option at 4,600 on DraftKings, 6,400, much less appealing over on FanDuel. But Clippers 21st in defensive efficiency to opposing power forwards. He scored below 24 fantasy points in just 3 of his last 10 games. Surprisingly, Ricky Rubio, who is always tough to trust with the minutes and the production, has topped 30 fantasy points in 7 of his last 10 games. I'm a little bit interested in him at 6K on DraftKings, 7K over on FanDuel. Ideal matchup. Clippers 22nd in defensive efficiency to opposing point guards on the season. Looking at Milwaukee at Sacramento, don't know why I don't have the Vegas total on this one. Milwaukee 5-point favorites in this one, a 231.5 over under. Giannis questionable for this game. I would expect him to play. Actually, let me double check. He might have been upgraded to probable. Giannis is probable. Sterling Brown is out. Dante DiVincenzo is out. And George Hill remains out for a few more games. Looking at the Milwaukee side of things, obviously Giannis is in a fantastic spot. It is Giannis. He leads the team in usage almost 30%, leads the team in rebounding rate against a fast-paced, bad defense that struggles to defend the rim. Giannis should absolutely go bonkers in the spot. He is my 2nd favorite pay-up option on the entire slate. But I'm going to be, at least in cash games, going to be looking at getting exposure in a couple of other places. That starts with Malcolm Brogdon, who continues to be one of my favorite options on a nightly basis. Kings really bad against opposing shooting guards. He takes 54% of his shots at the rim, where again the Kings really struggle to defend. He just continues to be a guy that I'm comfortable getting me 25, 30 plus fantasy points most nights, and I'll take that all day long at 5,400 over on DraftKings. FanDuel, it's a little bit of a different story because he's a little bit more expensive. But again, in cash, he's always a fantastic way to go. Outside of Brogdon, I do have interest in Eric Bledsoe as well. Again, Kings really struggling to defend the rim, 21st in defensive efficiency to opposing point guards. He's averaging 1.18 fantasy points per minute with a 24% use rate over the last 60 days. So it's a good spot for him. 6,500 on DraftKings, 6,800 on FanDuel. Obviously, people are probably going to be off of him because of getting burned last game, but I really like him here. Brook Lopez, jumping off the page in the projections, has been outstanding. Just mispriced over on DraftKings at 4,500. One of my favorite value centers on the slate. Joakim Noah's up there as well. Kings 26th in defensive efficiency to opposing centers. Their issues keeping opponents off the glass. Really appealing here. Just because, Brook Lopez, not a guy that we ever really count on for a bunch of rebounds, but they're giving up almost 50 rebounds per game, so that certainly doesn't hurt him. He scored below 24 fantasy points in just 2 of his last 10 games. It's a pretty good mark for a guy that's just 4,500 over on DraftKings. So Brook Lopez, I think, again, one of my favorite value centers on the slate. Joakim Noah, his brother Robin Lopez up there as well. The Bucks are in a better spot than the Kings, but the Kings are still some guys that we can look at. Marvin Bagley, given how well he's been playing and the fact that he got inserted in the starting lineup last game, is definitely interesting. Probably not the greatest of matchups, but he's 6,700 on DraftKings. That's still a little bit too cheap. I think 8K on FanDuel, that's a little bit more appropriately priced. Has top 40 fantasy points in 3 straight games, 4 of his last 5. Bucks league average defense against opposing power forwards. They've struggled on the boards lately, allowing 46 rebounds per game. So there's some upside available there for Bagley, who, again, more of a tournament option, I think, but still, minutes have been good for him. Production's been outstanding for him. I do kind of like me some Marvin Bagley. Given how many three-point attempts the Bucks give up, Buddy Hield should be in line for a good game. The Bucks do allow just 35.8% shooting on three-point attempts, but they're giving up almost 36 per game. It's one of the highest marks in the league. They also really struggle to defend corner threes, 42.1% allowed on corner threes, 10% of Hield's shots are corner threes, 36% of his shots above the break threes. I really like Buddy Hield, 6,400 on DraftKings, 6,900 over on FanDuel. Yeah, pretty good spot for him here. Bogdanovich, perfectly fine cash game option. Probably better places to look, but 4,900 on DraftKings is not too terribly bad. Pelicans at Lakers, last game of the night, and then we'll get out of here. Pelicans, Lakers. LeBron James. Pelicans, 29th defensive efficiency to opposing small forwards. LeBron James, over the last 10 games, 28% usage rate, 97.6 touches per game. He's touching the ball almost 100 times per game over the last 10 games. Add to that his 22.4 potential assists per game. Yeah, LeBron James should continue to feast in this spot. Obviously, some of the noise and some of the issues are a little bit concerning, but he's 11K over on DraftKings, 12K on FanDuel, projects to be a really good play. My highest projected player on the slate, even above James Harden here, which is kind of crazy. I still like Brandon Ingram. I don't buy into the hot streak that he's been on. It's going to fall off at some point. But he is touching the ball about 60 times per game over the last few games. Has scored over 20 points in 3 straight. Has top 40 fantasy points in 2 of the last 3. He's fine for GPPs. I don't want to use him in cash just because I don't believe in the recent hot streak. But you can still roll him out in GPPs, especially on DraftKings at 6,400. Kyle Kuzma getting some minutes as the 5. That's a little bit of a boost to him, but 27% usage rate, 1.01 fantasy points per minute since the start of February. Second, I think he's my second favorite Laker on the slate. Pretty good spot here for him. Outside of that, you can look at Reggie Bullock. Again, should see about 30 minutes. Still soaking up minutes. That's the best I can say about Reggie Bullock. On the Pelican side of things, my analysis doesn't get much better because, well, it's the Pelicans, and, well, Anthony Davis, who is now down to 7,200 on DraftKings, 8,700 on FanDuel. I think you can take a shot at Anthony Davis in tournaments on DraftKings. Still going to put up good games in limited minutes. Great matchup for him. If he was going to feast in any spot, it would maybe be here, unless he just really wants to help the Lakers win. So yeah. Julius Randle, great matchup, has top 40 fantasy points in 2 of the last 4, 30 minutes in 3 of the last 4. Obviously, revenge. Obviously, a great matchup. 7,800 on DraftKings, 8,100 on FanDuel. I'm fine with it. Elfrid Payton, the only guy that I really trust here. His minutes have been pretty predictable. He has, the triple-double upside that we always kind of expect out of Payton, that he hasn't really paid off much this season, but it's definitely there. Maybe not with Anthony Davis being back, but it's there. Matchup is great. Lakers, one of the worst teams in the NBA against opposing point guards over the last 10 games, 29th in defensive efficiency. Elfrid Payton, I think the only guy I trust here. You can look at Drew Holiday in GPPs, 7,600 on DraftKings, 9,200 on FanDuel. He's off limits on FanDuel, but on DraftKings, I think in GPPs he's fine. Has top 30 minutes in back-to-back games. They said they were going to limit his minutes. They're still giving him 30-plus in the last couple, so that's something worth keeping an eye on. Outside of that, I can't justify using Check Diallo, Jahlil Okafor at their current price tags without having a more secure minutes floor. So, yeah. That pretty much does it. That's the entire slate. Good luck on all your contests. I did keep this one shorter than usual, so that's good. I will be back on Friday.